Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, as you can hear from my voice, I've got COVID, so although the show must go on, I'm going to keep this introduction as short as possible. Don't worry, the actual discussion you're about to hear was recorded before the virus struck me. On this episode, I'm speaking to FT journalist Dan McCrum about his new book, Money Men, which tells the story of Wirecard, a German tech company that was built on fraud, and how Dan and his colleagues went about investigating it. It's an astonishing tale with so many human risk dynamics. So, without further ado, please enjoy my discussion with Dan McCrum on Wirecard. Dan, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Christian, hello. Thank you for having me on.
I am so excited because you've written a book that I absolutely love. But before we come on to that, how did you become an FT journalist? Because you've had a rather interesting career.
Oh, that's very kind. And so like a lot of journalists, I did something else first. I found myself working in the research department of an investment bank. And when I started, my first job there, I had to get in at 5 o'clock in the morning and literally photocopy the front page of every piece of day's research and put a pile of it on each trader's desk. and then I turned that into a job on the grad scheme and started working, on the trading floor, on the research floor. And I did that for like 3 or 4 years. And it was like fascinating, really interesting, what companies do you want to buy, or the accounting stuff, so it gave me this like understanding of finance. But I basically looked around and I was like, there's nobody here whose job I want. Like, what am I doing here? And, I'd had a conversation with a friend and they'd be like, okay, you could do any job in the world. And I was like, I'd be a journalist. No hesitation. And they just gave me this look like, it's not like you've got to go retrain to be a doctor or anything. So I just gave it a go. And I got a job on a share tipping magazine, basically turned what I was doing into a job in journalism. And the good fortune was that was owned by the FT group. And I got to see the internal job ads, and there was one going on Lex. And that was my way of sneaking into the FT on the quiet.
And I love that because it's something that a lot of people spend decades sitting in a job where they know something's not quite right, but they don't make that move. And you just kind of intuitively went, I can do this. And you happen to have selected a job that I guess played to your strengths and interests, because being a financial journalist, you do have to have an interest in the underlying subject. If you found finance dull, probably not a space. The FT is not your ultimate destination.
Yeah, I mean, it's true for a lot of jobs, but journalism in particular, you need to have an interest in the subject matter that you want to cover. Because if you're not interested in it, then whatever you write for the readers, they're not really going to be interested in it either. And I think that comes through, and particularly as a reporter, you want to be covering things that you think matter as well. Or, let's not get too carried away. I mean, journalists are sort of career-driven and...
Well, you're human.
With all those other things. We're human like everyone else. We want subjects we're interested in. We also want to be on the front page or the top of the website these days. And right. That's we're a weird bunch because it's not about the money. Like, you'd be an idiot if you went into journalism to make money. If you've got any, the Financial Times is doing very well. And there's a lot of financial media have sort of got this sustainable business model now. But I think that's one of the things that I tried to put in the book was that mismatch in resources between, so we're fighting this, and we'll get onto the whole story, but we're fighting this big German financial institution, which effectively has unlimited resources to throw at us. And I'm doing things like I'm taking a 1,000-mile detour on a flight to save the FT £170 on the plane ticket kind of thing. So, So you don't go into journalism for the money. And I think what you do is you just want to write stories which excite people or, change things.
Well, you've certainly achieved that, that's for sure.
And so you've talked about the entry, and the bit I loved in the book is it's simultaneously the story of Wirecard, but it's also about you and your career and some of the dynamics that you've talked about. And so we've got two dramas going on, which is the kind of the story that Dan is following, and then what is going on in your life. And you do bring your personal life into it in a way, not excessively, I hasten to add, but in a way that makes sense, that really makes it human. So I was envisaging that as Netflix or whoever picks this thing up, we're going to have two strands of this. The center will be you with the pieces going on, but you've very much chosen to pick up that point in the book. So this isn't just about Wirecard. It is also about your career and some of the things that were going on, which give us insights into how you as a journalist operate and the pressures and challenges you're under.
Yeah, that's right. Because the thing to understand is, so for anyone who isn't familiar with the Wirecard story, it was this little German fintech. It called itself sort of the PayPal of Europe. So it did this slightly complicated, this slightly boring technical thing to do with getting money from your credit card provider to the shop that you're trying to buy your flip-flops or whatever online. And over time, it got bigger and bigger. And I sort of come along and I look at it because I had a particular interest in looking for companies with dodgy accounting. And I come along and I go, this looks a bit fraudy. And try and write a few stories. And they get a little bit of interest from, hedge funds, accounting nerds, that sort of thing. And then without it really meaning to, the entire story took over my life. And it became this sort of 6-year odyssey trying to expose this criminal company when it seemed like no one, particularly the German authorities, would listen. And so when it came down to try and sort of sit down and write the book, what I wanted to do was sort of tell that story of the journalism and what it took, but also tell the story of the company, because you want to answer the question, well, how did this giant fraud happen? Why? And so that the way I decided to do it was it's this sort of this cat and mouse tale. So we flip backwards between my perspective on the outside going, what's going on? And then we flip into the company with all the machinations to try and stop us and the crimes and all of that thing. So that was the way I said about it. And that sort of naturally also follows like the highs and particularly the lows of my career, because it all went horribly wrong for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I had a real sense of reading it. I mean, this isn't a sort of, oh, let's just go and get some facts and report on it, right? There are some really serious consequences to you. Everything from online trolling to, am I and my family safe while I do this? And so I really had a sense of, you're not a reporter in a war zone where the dangers are obvious. And yeah, this wasn't cost free for you. This wasn't a sort of simple piece of reportage, right? You're living, breathing this. You're worrying about the consequences. There's stuff happening. You'll be almost as you're going, you're being reacted to, people reacting to it in all sorts of interesting ways. So quite a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah, it became really oppressive at like the darkest moments. And it sort of started out weird. So we approached the company and every way that we interacted with them made you go, this isn't a normal company. And it's small things. So like 2014, I send them a bunch of slightly nerdy accounting questions. And they come back with, this is really suspicious. Are you in league with short sellers trying to push down the Wirecard share price? Are you in cahoots with them or are you just naive? And we're like, I think we've hit a button here. Something's interesting. And then we start to get all the phishing emails from hackers. And then suddenly someone does get hacked and their emails get plastered on the internet. And then there are other guys who are, they start realizing cars are following them. And, I get this phone call where a guy tells me he thinks his house might have been broken into. And he's been told that my computer's been hacked as well. And you sort of start sending you into this tailspin. And then there are these moments where, so one of the strange aspects of the book is this sort of, it's like a competition between me and I've actually got a poster behind me on the shoulder, behind my shoulder, the sort of the master criminal, Jan Marsalek, who's this sort of Austrian whiz kid. Like he drops out of high school, is a sort of a tech wonderkind. everyone thinks he's the most charming man they've ever met. And he's the guy who's doing all the deals, schmoozing everybody. But he's also got this double life where he's doing all the dirty tricks and the accounting fraud. And he's got all these friends who happen to be in intelligence agencies. So like the head of the Libyan intelligence. He gets taken on holiday to Syria with Russian mercenaries. And this is one of the amazing things. I'm not sure I even put this in the book, where how that holiday came about was he was basically sitting around in this sort of small palace, which they rented in Munich, with his friends and this fixer who is sort of a Russian mercenary. And they're going, what do you want to do for like go on holiday? Because he's a workaholic. He can't go on holiday. And he sort of says, what I want to do is something no one else can. And so the Russian guy pipes up and is like, well, do you want to come hang out in Syria? He's like, yeah. And so but the thing is, there's got this like fabulous element to him. So you're not sure, is he a spy? Or is he just this total chancer who has bluffed his way to it? So he shows up in Syria and they're about to take him on like a walk around Palmyra just after the Russians have retaken it from ISIS. And he shows up with like the best body armor that money can buy, like Kevlar helmet, this special jacket, which has like sort of bulletproof vests built into it, all of this great stuff. And the Russians are like, yeah, this is really nice stuff here. I'm not going to try and do the accent. That's a terrible idea. Yeah, this is really nice stuff here. Yeah, this is amazing. But the problem is, if we start walking around in this, every sniper in the area is going to think you're the number one VIP and they're going to shoot you dead. So he has to leave it all in the hotel. And so that's the guy who we're up against. And so it's funny now. It's funny to tell these stories because it's all over. But in the moment where, we're slowly discovering that we're convinced the company's a fraud, we're convinced it's up to no good, and then we start picking up hints of like Russian intelligence connections. And then we discover there was this team of 30 private detectives running around London trying to catch us talking to our sources, that sort of thing. And you become really paranoid. I used to think that, I'd be riding home on my bike at night in the dark and you've got traffic behind you and you just have that voice in the back of your head going, if somebody knocked you off, that would solve a lot of problems for people, wouldn't it? And it's that sort of building pressure, which you're not really conscious of it happening. And it's only when it goes that you're suddenly like, oh, blimey, that was quite intense.
It's interesting because that's obviously partly what they want is to put psychological pressure on you because there's a risk associated with doing real harm. But if I can put a bit of psychology, maybe you'll back off and go find some other stories a little bit easier to report on.
Yeah, I mean, the game is intimidation. Absolutely. And, it really did work. That's one of the things is now it's all over and we talk about, it was this big 6-year investigation. But in the middle, I basically gave up because we had written a bunch of stories which said, looks like accounting fraud. We couldn't use the F word in print, fraud, because we would have got sued to oblivion by Wirecard's very expensive lawyers. But, we asked lots of questions about the accounts. Does it really make sense? And then the short sellers had come along in 2016 called Zatara Research. And they published an anonymous dossier saying it's a big money laundering enterprise. The whole thing's crooked and had created a lot of noise around that. So in early 2017, it was kind of like there are a lot of questions being asked about this company. And then the auditors, EY, came along and signed off the accounts again. And then the German financial regulator, BaFin, announced that it was going to conduct an investigation, but not into Wirecard. It was going to look into these short sellers, Zatara, who had attacked it, and they thought it looked like an attempt to manipulate the market. And so at that point, as you can see in the book, for various reasons, my career hadn't been going brilliantly because I'd been supposed to be doing a completely different job at that point and had been distracted by the whole Wirecard thing. And so I sort of get demoted. And I feel like I've done everything I can. There are easier stories out there. I'll try something else. And I think what's interesting as well about that point in the story, sort of for, investors or people who think about markets, is that there were two theories of the bad stuff going on inside Wirecard. There was the accounting fraud, and then there was money laundering. And one kind of excused the other. So I think a lot of investors looked at it and went, you know what? I think the reason they're a bit opaque about how their business works, and they don't really explain where they make all their money, is because they are operating in these grey areas. So maybe they're doing something a little bit shady, but apparently that's very profitable. And so we just won't ask too many questions. And seeing as none of the various financial authorities seem to be doing anything about it anyway, who are we to worry about that? Let's just count the profits.
So literally willful blindness.
Exactly. And I think you can be harsh on some people. I mean, there's a moment in the book, right, where so at that precise time, I go and present to a room full of investors. And we're talking about all of these reasons why you might think the company is overvalued, but also they're discussing the fabulous numbers, the way it's growing so quickly, payments is the future, the cashless society, all of those good things. And we're having this discussion with this room full of investors. And up until that point, I'd kind of been assuming the guys who owned big amounts of this stock weren't really engaging with the arguments. It's probably just they're not really familiar with the details or whatever. But we have this conversation, and one of them, who is one of Wirecard's biggest shareholders, starts muttering about, oh, yeah, no, I know there is this link to this weird little paperwork factory, which has got in trouble for a whole load of dummy shell companies and, has all the hallmarks of money laundering. And he goes, oh, yeah, there was a Wirecard executive who was literally a director of that company, wasn't that? And he's like, yeah, I never really got a good explanation for that. and it was that point where I'm sitting there going, you didn't think that was important? And so I spent a lot of my time talking to short sellers, who, if you're not familiar, a short seller is someone who basically bets that a share price is going to go down. There's a slightly complicated mechanism to it from which the name comes, but that's it. They're the pessimists in the room. And there's this famous short seller called Mark Cahodas, who he blew up in the financial crisis and is retired to sort of raise chicken and horses in wine country. And you get a lot of interesting characters in short selling. And he has this phrase, there's never only one cockroach in the kitchen.
And I love that. I thought that was really interesting.
And that's exactly the point, isn't it? You're like, if you're confronted with a big public company where everything is supposed to be above board, and you find out, hang on a second, he just said that, but that's not true, is it? The question you should be asking is, if he's lying about that, what else is he lying about? But I mean, I think the thing, we could talk about is like the way people approach investing, or they approach anything, is you find what you're looking for. Confirmation bias is very well known, but people tend to think about confirmation bias in the sense of, you're having an argument or you're thinking about things and you just look for things which agree with you.
Right, so politics, a good example, right? I've just sort of...
Yeah, exactly. You see this a lot of time. Circularity on Twitter, bubbles of information where you're like, everyone agrees with me. I must be right.
Well done me, I'm amazing. Right?
Yes. And so I was a bit weird. So I had, I worked in New York for 5 years. And one of the formative experiences for me was the financial crisis in 2008. And partly because I'd hardly been a journalist for any time at all at that point. And it's also, I got the job there and arrived 2 months before Lehman Brothers went bust. So it was kind of like show up, go, oh, what's going on? And then, oh my God, the whole world has gone crazy. And so that was quite instructive for sort of realizing that large numbers of people can be wrong when money is at stake. And so when I came back, I'd done a job, writing about hedge funds. And I came back and I was like, I was very lucky to land at the newspaper's blog, FT Alphaville, where I could basically choose whatever topics I wanted to write about. And the ones I decided I would write about was dodgy companies and interesting accounting and, things which short sellers are looking at. So when someone mentioned Wirecard to me, I was looking for fraud. I wanted to find the next Enron. So I looked at Wirecard and went, this looks a bit fraudy. Bias confirmed. But most, that's quite unusual. Most investors were just looking for the next big thing. Where can I make some money? Wirecard's growing really quickly. And payments seems like a big deal. The whole world's going online payments. Tick in the box. I'll have that in my portfolio. Thank you very much. And it made a lot of people a lot of money. And exactly like you say, once something has made you money, you're like, oh, I'm quite clever. I picked that stock and look how well I've done. Well done me. So if someone comes along and goes, I think it's all fake, you've not just got to convince them. You've got to get past that mental thing of accepting I was wrong about the thing that I'd done really well at. And that's a very hard thing to do from just a human psychological perspective.
And I'm fascinated by short selling because, as you rightly point out in the book and in your depiction just now, is that's played a huge part in you uncovering what's going on. So people who are motivated to play in that space have gone out and done a whole load of detective work around it because companies will advertise all the good news. They're going to try and avoid advertising the bad news. So short selling, there's some detective work required. But what I found was fascinating is there is a critique of short selling as a concept, which is this is awful. It's terrible behavior. Why do we need it? And the counter narrative I've always heard is sort of, well, market efficiency requires it. And if companies are well run and well managed, they shouldn't be scared of it. It's a correcting mechanism. And what I thought was interesting was you've proven there is some, there clearly are some people out there who are potentially doing things that are destructive from a systemic perspective, and they're not helpful. But this is a really interesting case study of actually where short selling has served that theoretical purpose. If they hadn't been there, you wouldn't have pursued it to the lengths you had, and we wouldn't have been where we are now. So this is, in a way, a victory for short selling in terms of it adding value to get positive societal outcomes.
I think so. I mean, yeah, so it's the whole Wirecard experience is a victory for the kind of work which short sellers do. And, it's like most things in finance. So I try and resist being completely black and white about it because there's lots of nuance. But, as a general thing, having short sellers means it's easier to buy and sell shares because they're selling shares when everyone else wants to buy them. And it's this interesting thing that creates liquidity, the ability to trade in the market. And I think that you need that. You need people who have an incentive to question how everything is going. Because, I think we've just seen this in the markets in the last year or so, particularly, with the collapse in crypto, but also the collapse in all these very highly valued tech stocks, where people thought the pandemic business model was going to go on forever. And it's like, well, actually, no, these things were overhyped. And it's natural, it's human. We get too excited about it. I think Gartner has that very famous hype cycle, where you get a new technology, everyone gets way overexcited, thinks it's going to be here tomorrow. Self-driving cars would be a good example.
Right.
And then you have this collapse in expectations because everyone gets disappointed. And then you just wait a while, and actually you do get to the point where it is really good, but it's just taken way longer. than everyone. And, it's an age-old story of greed and enthusiasm and over-exuberance, and then you fly too close to the sun and you crash. Now, what short sellers are good at as well is finding the people who aren't just flying too close to the sun, actually they're total crooks. And what they have created never really flew. I'm doing a horrible job of mixing metaphors here, but I hope you get the point of...
I was rather enjoying it.
And what I found is, well, so in financial markets, as a financial journalist, pretty much every source on a story that you deal with has a monetary incentive. So the executives want their stock options to vest. The bankers want to earn their fees. The lawyers, the auditors, they're all getting paid. And most people are getting paid when things go well. And that's great. Most of the time, things are going well. The onward march of progress. Everyone's getting richer. But it's good to have some people who have an incentive to look for the things which I think are journalistically interesting. There's a public interest in exposing corruption and fraud and theft and wrongdoing. And so I was also really lucky, and nobody else seemed to be paying that much attention to these guys. So I was like, I think there could be some stories which other people aren't trying to write here.
And one of the things that I find really interesting, and we've seen this this isn't the only example, VW also comes to mind, is the perception of governance in Germany. And if you'd gone back a few years, you would have said, well, that sort of thing wouldn't be happening in Germany. And there's a variety of narratives, some of which are based on, for example, governance structures that seem to promote workers have more rights there. So you get more voices sitting around the boardroom, a tradition of sort of well-run companies, and less of a sort of seemingly fast and loose culture. And yet what we've seen in recent years, we've got with the VW Dieselgate scandal, we've got Wirecard, and so on and so forth, and you pick this up in the book, is that sort of veneer of, well, that wouldn't happen in Germany. We do things properly here. Clearly is that a veneer. There's lots of things going on behind the scenes. And so I'm fascinated by your thoughts on that, because did that at any point enter your mind? You sort of think, well, hold on, I could see this happening in jurisdiction X, but this is a German company. That seems a bit weird.
I think one of the things which comes through is my constant surprise at the way people react and institutions react. And so what happens is sort of the key, there's a key moment in the story where Wirecard enters the DAX index, which is the DAX 30 is equivalent to the FTSE 100, which is a big deal, very prestigious. And at that moment, a whistleblower's mother in Singapore gets in touch with me. And she's this amazing woman. She raised her son as a single mother. She was forced into an arranged marriage, kicked out her alcoholic husband, and, her son goes on to become this very successful lawyer. And he goes to work at Wirecard in Singapore and discovers a whole bunch of wrongdoing, launches this investigation, but he's the one who gets forced out. And his mum isn't going to stand for this. He's just busy looking for another job. But she's like, I'm not going to let them get away with it. So she starts contacting journalists. And luckily, she sends me an email saying, would you be interested in, wrongdoing at a financial company? And it turns out it's Wirecard, because she'd seen the stories I'd written before. And this means that I'm finally able to write, not speculation from the outside, but, real whistleblower information going, there's some fraud going on inside here. They're cooking the books. And we publish a whole series of stories. In each one, we think this is the smoking gun. Like my colleague Stefania Palmer goes to the Philippines, and we have the address of this big customer of Wirecard's, another payments company. It's got this website. It says it's all, does lots of exciting technology, payments related things. We can see in Wirecard's books, it owes it, $5 million, something like that. But it's a bit weird because they never pay the money. They just keep chalking up sales each each month. And she goes to visit it, and we find out why. It's the house of a fisherman. And she knocks on the door and she walks in, and there's like two guys giving a poodle a haircut standing on a table. And they're like, no, we've never heard of any payments company. What on earth are you talking about? So we're like, at that point, you're going, okay, this is obviously a fraud. Everyone is going to see it. So we published the story. And what we then learned is how hard it is to change minds. And what Wirecard did was very clever. Is it basically, as soon as we started writing these stories, it accused us of market manipulation. This old story, I'm in league with short sellers. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, same old script. But the incredible thing is, the German authorities believe them. So we do what we think is some pretty good work. Look, world, here's an important story. And the next thing we know, we're under criminal investigation for leaking the story to short sellers. And all these stories in the Financial Times are, just part of this weird vendetta of this one English reporter who was trying to bring down Germany's next big tech giant. And when that happens, you genuinely start to go slightly mad. You're like, what is happening here? Are we through the looking glass?
Is your sense that that was something that was particularly effective in Germany, where the establishment might want to close ranks? And I'll leave that term loosely defined, whether it's regulators or sort of societies as a whole. Or is that a narrative that would have played, I don't know, in the UK or somewhere else?
I mean, we thought about this because, it's interesting to think, let's say the German business newspaper Handelsblatt started running a whole bunch of stories saying, oh, we found fraud and wrongdoing going on in Barclays. You can sort of imagine a section of the press going, these weird German reporters and this strange German story, and maybe, a little bit of jingoistic closing of ranks and treating it as a weird thing. And I think it's not so much that the German press ignored it, is what they did is they sort of allowed it to become this battle between the Financial Times and Wirecard, in which they weren't picking a side. It was more, grab the popcorn, we'll watch what's happening, and who knows what the answer is. And there were a couple of German publications which did sort of follow up and do more digging and go, yeah, there's really something here. But yeah, it did seem like there was this sort of closing of ranks, this view that, yeah, there's this sort of Anglo-Saxon capitalist, money-grubbing conspiracy against this German company. And the thing is, I mean, one of the, I try and resist making big sweeping conclusions about Germany because, cliches don't get us very far. And also, I can barely speak German. I was lucky in that Wirecard operated in English because it was this big international company. And the book is my personal story of encountering German institutions sort of at the sharp end in these very weird and crazy circumstances. And that's all I can really talk about. I'm not going to, claim to have some deep understanding of German culture. And it was one of the things that we really struggled with as well, that it was really hard to get the answer. And, what I do try to do in the book is sort of give the perspective of some of the people who are involved, because, it's what you can do is reduce it to a human level and try and understand the experiences of the people inside the company. And so there's this great German salesman who was very kind and spoke to me a lot, called Martin Osterloh. And he was there almost from the beginning. So he worked in Wirecard for 15 years. And he sort of says, I'm like the idiot guy in the film who knows all of these people, is standing right next to the conspiracy, but has no idea what's going on. And when I spoke to people in Munich, they were working at a big successful company. And I went to the offices, and you would walk around. They had several buildings, thousands of people, doing all sorts of legitimate things. And the dirty secret was that was losing money hand over fist. But, if making profits doesn't matter, you can hire a bunch of people, right? And you get their perspective, but you also get the interesting thing about lots of people said, there were things that they noticed, but at the time they brushed it away. So Martin says, he always realized Wirecard's claims to have like amazing technology because, it was another company which claimed it was a technology company first, bank and financial institution second. There's an awful lot of that about.
Right.
And he dealt with their shonky technology on a day-to-day basis. So he knew but he was like, I just put it down to spin. And then there's this, and he would occasionally work with this guy who, was a horrible racist. He's one of the bad guys, Oliver Bellenhaus, who lived in the world's tallest building in Dubai. And he said various racist things at different times. But he would kind of excuse it. He would, there's this moment where they're at a conference, and he sort of makes a rather unfortunate joke to the black guy who wanders up, who laughs it off and storms away, and he's like, Oliver, if he goes to the police, you're going to get arrested. But then at the same time, he's like, no, I don't think he's racist. I think he just enjoyed crossing lines and tweaking people. And, and it's that sort of human ability to sort of rationalize what is happening in front of your own eyes to fit the mental model that you have. And so if you think Wirecard is a successful company, if you think the chief executive, Marcus Brown, is a successful tech founder, then you take whatever information appears in front of you and you make it fit.
And the thing I thought was fascinating, and clearly you're going to pick these because these are great stories. There's a lot of things that sort of toxic stories. I mean, that racism incident's a good example, but you've got lunatic things happening that will be brilliant when it comes to filming the movie. So I'm thinking of the sorts of scenes that we remember from Wolf of Wall Street, the movie. You've got sort of loads of examples of those things. And so it seems to me it's really interesting when we have these sort of frauds going on these epic scales. There's always, it's back to the cockroach point. There's always these sort of, it almost gets pushed to a logical extremity. You have these ridiculous stories that we sort of laugh about out of context, but it's not even like I can sort of turn a blind eye to one another. There are some outrageous things going on that people, so to your point around our ability to normalize, you might see those out. You would think that the more outrageous, the more it would be. Well, hold on a minute, right? I can ignore some basic things I see, but there's some appalling things going on, and yet it's almost like it gets more and more appalling. And so I think there's an interesting illustration of sort of how far people who are caught up in this thing in wrongdoing, they want to push the limits. And so I love these sort of these images, the stories that you tell in the book. So I just went, what the hell? And wouldn't that be an alarm bell? But actually, it almost seems like the really outrageous stuff doesn't have the effect you'd expect. If anything, that just encourages people to go further.
I mean, I don't want to give away the ending too much. I mean, we all know the big ending, but
so what happened to the company?
There's a chapter in Manila towards the end, which was one of my absolute favorites writing it, because the whole thing has the quality of farce to it. And you're like, everything about it screams, this is completely bizarre. Like so they're at the moment where the fraud has basically been exposed. The FT has written a story saying Wirecard is faking its sales. And they're faking it in this way, using these people. And here are the documents which show exactly how they're doing it. So that's October 2019. And Wirecard does what most companies do is, and it's a strange thing, we seem to allow companies to investigate themselves.
Right. What could possibly go wrong with that? Right, yeah. Can you imagine if, say the Times wrote,
there's this big drug cartel, and here's how they're shipping the drugs, and here's who's doing it, and here's all the internal correspondence which shows they're doing it. And can you imagine the head of the cartel going, well, actually, we've appointed a reputable team of lawyers and accountants to come in, and they're going to do an internal investigation, and we're sure that it will clear us that actually this is an entirely legitimate sugar distribution business. And all these packets flying around are for, people who find themselves with a cup of tea, and all they need is a packet of sugar at that precise moment. So the guy in the moped turns up with it. And all the police are like, sure, yeah, I mean, this seems very complicated. So seeing as it's a business, we'll just let your team do their own work first. And this is routine in corporate. This is how corporate life happens. So Wirecard says, right, yeah, okay. We'll bring in an outside accounting firm to check everything. And so that's the context for this sort of internal inquiry which happens. The company's been accused of fraud, and they go to Manila. And there's a lawyer called Mark Tolentino who goes on YouTube. He's got one of those, little plaques saying he's got 100,000 viewers. And his specialty is advising on divorce and, family law, that sort of thing. And Wirecard go, yes, so that 1.9 billion euros of cash, that's the lawyer who's looking after it. And this team of accountants and lawyers show up at his office. And the whole thing is completely bizarre. And they go, oh, yes, please tell us about it. It's like, all right, we should go to the banks. So they all go downstairs and they hop into cars. And for some reason, they've got police motorcycle outriders. Because the lawyer has spent most of the time in his office going, by the way, I'm very good friends with the president, Rodrigo Duterte. And I'm a man of influence. And he's like, yeah, no, I don't like to wait in traffic. And remember, this is about 1.9 billion euros, which is supposed to be in a couple of Philippine banks. And he goes, right now, he's in charge. It's complicated, but for some reason, this family lawyer is in charge of the accounts. And so they go, okay, we're going to go visit the banks. And they're right by the financial district. So they think, right, okay, we'll be going to head office. It's just over there. And then they drive for 45 minutes with police outriders. So they're not waiting in traffic. And they turn up at this tiny branch on a street with, bicycle repair shops. And, imagine a slightly rural street in Manila. And they crowd into this tiny bank branch where someone pops up and goes, hello. Right. What? Wirecard. Yes, Wirecard. Hardly speaks English and hands over an envelope which says, yes, don't worry, there's a very large amount of Wirecard's money in the care of this strange lawyer. And then it carries on. And I mean, even now I wonder, I've spoken to some of the people there who were going, well, this is really weird. But at the same time, they were rationalizing it because they were sort of clinging to any thread, because at that point, the alternative is even worse, right? So you're all doing this and you're all going, what on earth is happening to it? Is this candid camera? Are we in some sort of bizarre scene? Right. But if you're not in that, then it's like, oh, so the whole thing is fake and there's nothing there whatsoever. So it's kind of like that. It's sort of like the don't look down, because it's way worse if you do.
Right, because so that's interesting. So the candid camera thing is, oh, okay, that's an explanation. This is a bit weird, right? Simple explanation, and I can go on with my life and go, that wasn't that funny. I was part of a candid camera thing. So it solves the problem. I'm not really going to have to deal with it. I'm slightly embarrassed by my reaction, but that would be a solution to the dilemma that would give us an easy out.
Yes.
And to your point here, if I have to face reality, I'm going to have to deal with a whole load of stuff. This is a massive problem. So the easiest route out from a cognitive perspective is I'll just keep this thing going and I'll find ways to deal with it so that I can just get on with my life, right? And then I don't have to think too hard.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's also, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with sort of audit processes and, the way these accounting firms work. But, there is literally a box ticking quality to it, in which, they're not the police. They are, and in a normal audit of, when your auditors show up at a company, generally they assume that the management aren't lying to them. That's just your base starting point, because if you think about it, if you had to check every single time, are these people liars? You would waste an unbelievable amount of time and effort, because 99% of the time, people aren't psychopaths. and so I think, what I try to show in the book are these moments where Wirecard has sort of been exposed. And now it's the job of the professionals to go, what's going on? And they seem to understand the process and what they need to do to get the right tick in the right box. And so Wirecard has said, this is how their business works. And we kind of have to trust them because it's complicated in its payments and it's unusual. But hey, they're a fast-growing fintech. They're breaking all the rules. They're doing things they have to do to grow really fast. So let's cut them a bit of slack and say, okay, this is how they say they do it. And now we go and visit, and things are happening as Wirecard has said they're supposed to. And that gets you a long way, because very few people have the job to sort of step all the way back and go, hang on a second, none of this makes any sense. And actually there's a line in the book which, so I like quoting the short sellers because they have these nice little phrases which does it. So there's another guy called Eduardo Marques, who's Brazilian. And I mean, we talk about the film. I mean, he's straight out of Central Casting. He's a surfer who most of the time he was living in California. And but it's kind of funny now because he would get so worked up because we'd written all these stories going, look, there's a smoking gun. There's nothing there. But Wirecard would dismiss it by saying, well, the numbers aren't very big. It's just a small local matter. And to begin with, the numbers were quite small. It was like 30 million euros in the context of a company with 2 billion euros of annual sales. And he was like, no, you've got it all the wrong way round. The amounts don't matter. It's the practices. Why on earth was Wirecard letting this happen? Why on earth, in this big financial institution, didn't they fire everybody the moment it was first raised? That's what you should focus on.
Right, so a complete control failure.
Yes.
And actually, small things can get big very, very quickly. And we know that human beings, if they're given a little bit of latitude, can get carried away. I'll put it politely. And so this is a real simple control point, which is actually we often get blinded by quantum, but in fact, actually, we should start to look at the basic principles. And if somebody's done something wrong, I always viewed it a little bit like sort of people going, people accused of insider dealing, and they say things like, "Well, I didn't make any money." Well, the fact that you're crap at it, right, doesn't mean it wasn't a crime in the first place, right? And so there is this, and I guess I will to a certain extent say that's what makes good copy, right? You want a big number in the headline because that's more exciting. It's easier to write a story, I'm guessing, if the fine is massive or the loss is massive or the theft is massive. If it's a small number, it's less interesting for us because we think, well, a small number equals not significant. And that's the illustration of why it does matter.
Yes. And there was also there was this element, which, I mean, one of the joys of being able to put it all down in a book is to go, okay, so we wrote the stories at the time, which were telling you what was going on, but, oh boy, there was so much more going on behind the scenes. And we could never write it because Wirecard's fingerprints were never on like the bad stuff, the dirty tricks, all of that. So, even like there's this signature moment. There's this lunch where we film the bad guy undercover in this fancy restaurant in Mayfair with a camera hidden in a handbag. So my editor, Paul Murphy, is the one who is lunching him because I couldn't be anywhere near it. And he literally sort of asks him about like the hacking and the surveillance. And he goes, oh, no, well, I mean, it might have been friends of ours, but not us. It's like, but then he admits like, well, I mean, but he did have us checked out. And, you know, apparently you live very normal lives. But the thing is, and it was this, but then, you know, you get back to the office and you're like, what have we literally got here? We've got nothing concrete that we can present to the readers of the Financial Times. So now to be able to tell this sort of like this adventure that we had, you know, that's part of the fun.
That's really interesting. So I always talk about anecdata.
Yeah.
Right. So we need data as to what tells us what's happened, and anecdotes kind of explain why. And so I love this idea of combining those two things. And that's really interesting because you're right. The paper couldn't publish something, partly because you haven't got the room, but also because, as you say, it's sort of peripheral to it. And you go, why is the FT turned into some sort of salacious storytelling? You know, that's not what that's about. And yet, in order to be able to get to story, you need to deal with that thing. So you kind of need an outlet for these things. It's almost the cutting room floor for the newspaper. And you've pulled all that together and said, okay, here's the bigger context. Here's the stuff that we couldn't reveal. And that gives a much richer, rounded picture because we pick up these human stories.
Exactly. And that's why I put the story about the silver mine in the book. So there's this terrific short seller called John Hempton of Bronte Capital. You can find him on Twitter. He's quite prolific. And he loves a good story. But he is good at finding those problematic companies. I mean, he told this story about a silver mine. And, you know, the famous Mark Twain line, what is it? A mine is a hole in the ground with a liar on top. And so he finds this mine in Canada where they're at that stage where they've had a whole bunch of ore and they've said, oh, well, we've had it tested and it's really promising. It looks like there's a nice vein of silver here. Can we have some money to go and build the mine proper? But the weird thing is, the mine is in British Columbia, but they had all the ore processed in Montana. So he came and did this talk about it, and he takes us through his process of like, okay, well, this doesn't make any sense. So how do you even get this big pile of rocks from British Columbia to Montana? Let's look at the train lines. So he pulls up the train lines and he shows you basically have to take this absurd detour halfway across the country to go and then go back to Montana. And then they pull up the customs records, and they're like, well, we can't find anything relevant here. And then they go, and also, by the way, there's a railhead near the mine, but it's got the wrong sort of track. And so there are none of the right rail cars for shipping all of this mine. And this is how the short sellers work. They're like, okay, is it plausible? What could happen? Okay, doesn't make any sense. Tick. Doesn't make any sense. This is totally non-cost effective. Tick. Everything is adding up to this is a big lie. But the thing is, he thinks he's got like slam dunk short. And one of the best things about a fraud from the perspective of an investor, and this is why they like them, is you can get a certainty which you can't get with trying to guess, you know, how many cars is Tesla going to sell next year? Finger in the air kind of stuff. Whereas if you're like, okay, this company is a fraud, total certainty, at some point, the share price is probably going to go to zero. When it's exposed, maybe quite quickly. That's the incentive. And he really thinks he's got it. But then he manages to speak to this laborer from a nearby Indian reservation. And he tells him, oh, yeah, actually, yeah, me and a bunch of guys, we spent this whole time literally filling sacks with rocks and lifting them by hand into boxcars for the mining company. And it's like, oh, Like, it doesn't make any sense, but it did happen.
Right.
And that's the thing you always have to be wary of as a journalist. You know, some stories are seductive. The phrase we have is, too good to check. But obviously, the whole point of the job is to check them. And sometimes you're like, oh, this is an amazing story. This is an amazing story. Oh, actually, no, it isn't after all.
Final. I could keep talking to you forever, but final question for you is: do I detect a sort of begrudging respect for the fraud and the fraudsters? Because you've used those words like it's very clever, and they've done lots of things that requires a level of ingenuity. And sort of on the face of it, we can laugh about some of these things, and there is an element of sort of Wile E. Coyote type logic to some of the stuff. But there was some fundamentally smart stuff going on that has made, and some of it deeply unpleasant and smart, but some of it sort of very clever and cunning. Is there an element of respect on your part where you sort of go, I don't like it, but whoa, that was clever?
Yeah. I mean, it's I guess, cojones, that ability to lie to people's faces, to maintain the lie in the face of all evidence. And I talked about the cat and mouse quality. And I guess it was a sort of grudging respect. And I mean, it's a very strange thing to have enemies. And we ultimately realized, we were it was like an existential battle. It was like we had to kill them or they had to kill us, because they made it this question of the reputation of the entire Financial Times. And in some respects, that was stupid. If they had right at the start admitted to a few small local problems, we might have declared victory, said good story, gone away, well done. But because they were like, you're corrupt, you're in league with short sellers and all the rest of it, they meant we could never walk away from the story. And there were moments, and sort of part of, we learned a lot of lessons along the way. And each time we thought we had got them, they pulled another rabbit out of the hat. And it was just, I mean, so there were points where I genuinely thought they're going to get away with this.
Right. Reminds me of something in the political arena, but we can leave that for another show. Dan, firstly, thank you for the work that you do, right? Because I think it's a really good illustration of how incredibly important journalism is. And in an era where there's a lot of sort of fake news in every sense of the word, I think what you and your colleagues are doing is incredibly valuable. And I'm glad that we have you. And I'm glad that we've got people like you with a sense of curiosity and bravery that deliver that. So thank you for that. The second is the book was amazing. I loved it. And as I said to you before we started recording, I couldn't put it down. And even though you kind of know the Wirecard script from what you see in the paper, this is sort of blowing it open and revealing a whole load more details. And I'm going to want to go back to it and just have another read through some of the chunks. So it comes highly recommended. I will put links to it in the show notes. But thank you so much for, one, writing it, and secondly, for your time on the show and being a great guest.
Christian, thank you very much. That's so kind. And I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for the great questions.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Dan for appearing and to you for listening. For more information on Money Men and links to articles and other relevant resources, have a look in the show notes. For more on human risk and the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. COVID and my voice permitting, I'll be back with another episode of the show very soon. I'm off back to bed to recover, but please stay safe, and thanks for listening.